When Air Force veteran David appeared on the traveling TV series Antiques Roadshow, brandishing his old watch, it's highly unlikely that he realized the heirloom would be worth such a staggering sum. In fact, when he found out its true value, he appeared to drop to the ground in a dead faint. But just how much was David's Rolex worth? And how had he been unaware of its incredible story for almost 50 years? Hello, wonderful people. I'm Scott Leffler for WonderBot. And here is when a veteran learned the value of his old Rolex. His reaction left Antiques Roadshow fans floored. Before we begin, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell for more amazing videos. David had not enjoyed the kind of life that allowed him to indulge his love of Rolexes in the lap of luxury. Far from it. He was drafted during the Vietnam War. At the time, all young men aged 18 to 25 were assigned a number for each draft lottery. And when a number was pulled, anyone with that digit or less who was eligible to be part of the military was called up to serve. When David's number was pulled, then he was told he'd have to join a branch of the military. Otherwise, he'd be enlisted automatically by the following January. And so the veteran consequently decided to join the U.S. Air Force, where he began serving in munitions. More specifically, he was dealing with explosive ordnance disposal. For David, this primarily involved clearing roadways of landmines, as well as clearing up impaired munition storage facilities. There were multiple children and adults that were injured as a result of unexploded ordnance, the veteran said during an episode of Antiques Roadshow in January 2020. The hazard is still there today. From 1973, David spent 2 years stationed in Thailand, and during that stint he flew on a number of continental airlines. It was on these flights that he first developed a fondness for Rolex. You see, he noticed that pilots would frequently wear the brand's watches and subsequently found himself intrigued by the timepieces. David decided he wanted to buy a Rolex watch for himself, but quickly discovered that they were beyond his budget. For a while then, he put the idea on the back burner. But eventually he was transferred to another base where he spent time scuba diving. And with Rolex's reputation as a great choice for scuba divers, it's likely no surprise that the activity brought the watch brand back to the forefront of his mind. In the end, David managed to find a Rolex for what he considered to be a reasonable price, $345.97, with a 10% discount. Nevertheless, it was still quite an extravagance, supposedly amounting to around a month's military salary in the 1970s. The veteran ordered the watch through the on-base department store in November 1974, but he'd have to wait for months. You see, the pricey purchase didn't arrive until April the following year. And the particular variant that David had settled for was a Rolex Oyster Cosmograph. Yet, according to the veteran's account, he never actually used the timepiece. No, when it arrived, he decided that it was perhaps too nice to wear while scuba diving. So he simply placed it in a safety deposit box, where it remained for another 3 to 4 decades. The watch supposedly only left its secure housing on 2 or 3 occasions during all that time, in fact. And when it did, it was only for David to admire it proudly before it was carefully placed back into storage. As a result, the timepiece was in fantastic condition, particularly given its age. What's more, David also kept all the original documentation he'd received when buying it. It's therefore quite understandable that David was so interested in getting a valuation for the Rolex. And to do so, he decided to speak to the experts of Antiques Roadshow. The hit series has gained quite a reputation for accurately appraising people's antiques, and it's been running for more than 2 decades in the United States. However, while the US version of the show has undoubtedly been successful, the series actually has its roots in Britain. The original Antiques Roadshow began life as a BBC documentary, you see, which followed members of an auctioneering institution from London as they traveled around England's West Country. The first episode was filmed on May 17, 1977, and was met with success that the format has effectively never changed. The UK version of Antiques Roadshow now spans more than 40 individual series too, and it's remained with the BBC for its entire history and has even spawned spin-off shows. The children's special, Antiques Roadshow The Next Generation, for instance, was broadcast every Christmas from 1991 to 2006. Meanwhile, a short-lived offshoot dubbed 20th Century Roadshow aired briefly in 2005. But it's not just the original British show that's proved popular enough for spin-offs over the years. Indeed, a half-hour American show titled Antiques Roadshow FYI aired for a short time in 2005. And the program, which offered a more in-depth look at collecting and antiques in general, also followed up on items that had previously featured in the main series. In the US, meanwhile, Antiques Roadshow appraisers valued a 1904 work by Mexican painter Diego Rivera, spouse of acclaimed artist Frida Kahlo, at between $800,000 and $1 million in 2012. And 6 years later, in light of auctions for Rivera's other paintings, a second appraisal of the artwork placed the value at even higher, anywhere from $1.2 million to a dizzying $2.2 million. It's not only rare antiques that the show spotlights. The US version, broadcast by PBS, is taped at numerous locations across the country, with smaller, lesser-known cities often acting as the backdrop for the beloved franchise. These places, generally disclosed ahead of time, include settlements such as Rapid City in South Dakota, Biloxi in Mississippi, and Chattanooga in Tennessee. And for one episode in January 2020, the cast and crew of Antiques Roadshow traveled to yet another little-known treasure, Bonanzaville, a museum complex located in the city of West Fargo in North Dakota. The area is comprised of 40 different historical and modern buildings. It was here that David seized on the opportunity to get his Rolex examined. The appraisal of David's Rolex has since been uploaded to Antiques Roadshow's YouTube channel, where it's racked up more than 7.5 million views. In the clip, appraiser Peter Plains quizzes David on his backstory and how he came to acquire the watch. He then asks the veteran about what's happened to the timepiece in the years since to help him reach his verdict. With all that information in mind, Plains subsequently draws on his knowledge of rare watches to offer an assessment. He begins by looking over all the paperwork that David diligently kept with the watch, including the brochure, receipts, and even the original warranty paper. Because this latter sheet is blank and can therefore add value to any watch, Plains estimates that it alone is worth around $2,000. The appraiser then focuses on the watch itself, highlighting all the relevant details that will help him to ascertain its price. First, he points out that the watch isn't just a regular Rolex cosmograph, it's an oyster variant, in fact, which refers to the screw-down buttons on the side of the watch's body. According to Plains, this particular Rolex was produced in two styles, both with and without screw-down buttons. It's the latter feature that makes the watch so popular, though, because these buttons allowed it to be submerged in water. And back when the timepiece was first released, this novelty was a great incentive for buyers from all over the globe. Plains also addressed the condition of the watch, noting that it's been very well looked after over the years. Indeed, the foil sticker on the watch's back is still present, showing a reference number of 6263. Had it been worn, that's the first thing that would wear off the watch, the appraiser explains. He then points to the date mark, which shows the watch was produced in 1971. Plains then explains that collectors adore this particular model, which is known as the Daytona Rolex, thanks in part to Paul Newman. You see, the actor wore the watch in the 1969 movie Winning, which apparently first inspired his love of motorsports. He subsequently became a competitive race car driver, and the timepiece was an iconic part of his image. The Washington Post reporter Travis Andrews explained the watch's popularity in 2017. The mechanical watch radiates coolness, much like its owner, he wrote. It was a constant companion to Newman's left wrist in magazine shoots, paparazzi photos, and while he was speeding around in his race cars. Incredibly, Newman's actual watch sold for a record $17.8 million at auction in 2017. As the clip continues, Plains tells David that models of the watch Newman wore usually fetch around $150,000 to $200,000 at auction. And to his credit, the veteran remains surprisingly calm, despite being quoted such an enormous sum of money. But what the appraiser says next prompts an entirely different reaction from David. Yes, Plains explains that David's watch is even more special than the model Newman wore, because it's an oyster variant. They did that for an extremely short period of time, the appraiser says. We refer to that as the Mark II dial. And this particular model, being marked oyster, is extremely rare. A watch like this at auction is worth about $400,000. At that moment, upon hearing this even larger figure, David seems to collapse to the floor in shock, waving his legs in the air for effect. Plains then rushes across the table to check that the veteran's okay, while voices off camera can be heard laughing at his dramatic reaction. Thankfully, David's absolutely fine, and the sprightly fellow quickly hops back up, laughing in disbelief at the news he's just been given. But Plains then tells him, "Don't fall, I'm not done yet." Yes, it turns out that the appraiser chose his words carefully when he said a watch like David's sells for $400,000. That's because, largely thanks to the condition David's watch is in, it isn't actually worth that eye-watering amount. Far from it. It's a new old stock watch with no wear in it, the original foil sticker on the back of it, and we have this complete documentation, Plains says. It's maybe one of the very few in the whole world that was still never worn. So, with all this information in mind, the appraiser then reveals that David's watch would likely fetch an eye-watering $500,000 to $700,000 at auction. This time, David manages to stay on his feet. It's clear, though, that he's totally blown away by the figure Plains has just uttered. He shakes his head in continued disbelief and makes a remark that's been bleeped out by the show's producers too. Nevertheless, Plains responds that he's very serious about his appraisal. "It's an absolutely fabulous find," Plains confirms. "It's one of the rarest Paul Newman models, and in this condition, I don't think there's a better one in the world. I can't thank you enough for bringing me one of the greatest watches to have ever been on Antiques Roadshow, and thank you very much for your service." The appraiser then warns David that he can't wear his magnificent antique, for if he does, the value will drop to around $400,000. However, it's not known what the veteran's plans are for his staggeringly valuable collectible. He's saved it all these years, Plains told the Washington Post in January 2020. He may be saving it more. According to Plains, David's reaction stands out as particularly memorable. That's perhaps not too surprising, though, given that his Rolex is the most valuable ever to appear on the show. But it's not the most valuable watch ever featured. No, that honor apparently belonged to another timepiece, which is now said to be worth $2 million to $3 million.